You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. For many people, the year following strict pandemic lockdowns felt like coming out of hibernation. As the proverbial chains came off, some went wild. Others were more cautious and set new priorities for their lives. Some did a mix of both, like the writer Glynnis MacNicol. After enduring nearly a year of isolation and a punishing lack of human touch, MacNicol boarded a plane for Paris in August 2021 to sublet a friend's apartment for the month. She was 47 years old and on a very specific mission: 100% enjoyment, an exploration of pleasure. Her memoir about this time, called I'm Mostly Here to Enjoy Myself, came out a few months ago, and I was delighted to interview her in Paris last week at the Red Wheelbarrow bookstore. This episode is a recording of that conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And don't forget to check the show description for a link to order a copy of the book.
By this point, everyone has seen this cover, right? I think even if you don't know what the book is about, maybe you've seen it across your feeds, although Instagram has tried really diligently to block it from everyone's feeds, citing pornography. So it's been quite difficult, actually, in a lot of ways, to promote on social media where everyone conceivably discovers books for that reason. But you've also been writing on these themes in the New York Times, in the op-eds this summer. And it's quite exciting, I think, to have you here because you've just done these events in the US, but your story takes place in Paris, and now you're back.
And now I'm back.
I know one other person in the audience asked this question. I think it's Sophie, who I was exchanging with earlier. And it was the first thing that I kind of wondered as well when I was reading, which is, could any other destination have delivered what you needed in that very particular post-COVID isolation moment?
Right. A couple of people have asked me that. So for those of you who haven't read, the book takes place in Paris in August of 2021, after I was very alone for a year in my very small New York City studio apartment on the top floor, smaller than this bookstore. And I landed in Paris and had 5 very enjoyable weeks. So could it have taken place anywhere else? I didn't come with the intention of writing the book. And so it wasn't sort of conceived, like it wasn't it wasn't a travelogue. It wasn't like I planned it and I knew I wanted to write about Paris. I was in Paris because I'd spent summers here for a few years prior at a friend group. We were in the audience that were here, and I knew the city and I missed it so much because I'd been coming here so regularly, and to have not been here for, a year and a half or 2 years or whatever it was. So I don't know. I don't claim to like know Paris the way Parisians do or people who've lived here for such a long time, but I knew it well enough that I felt comfortable writing about it. I think if I'd gone somewhere else, it would have been a travelogue very directly because it would have been in a brand new place in that sense of exploring something that you don't know anything about. Whereas coming here, I can bike Paris without a map. I have like regular haunts and friends and rituals and routines, which were all a little off that summer, obviously, for all of us. But so I don't know. But I also think in addition to that, the French, particularly compared to Americans, please keep in mind I've lived in New York City for my adult life, prioritize pleasure in a different way. And it does come with a degree of enjoyment, particularly when you don't live here full time and only brush up against the bureaucracy as opposed to like get plunged into it. So I think that there's like that added aspect to it. But the book genuinely came about months later when I was going back and reading my journals, and I was really enjoying my own journals.
So you keep a pretty...
I've been keeping a journal since I was 6 years old. And in my first journal, I pulled it up for a podcast I was doing on a different subject, and the journal entry said, I want to be a writer. I don't know what kind of writer, but I wanted, like, that's one of my early journal entries. So
from age 6? From age
6 in my scratchy, illegible handwriting. So I was rereading my journal entries months later, and I thought, oh, this is so wonderful. New York had gone back into lockdown, and I was really missing it. And I thought, I wonder if I can capture some element of this on the page, which was sort of the motivation for the book.
But also, do you associate, in all of the summers that you spent here, had you associated Paris with pleasure in the way so many people do?
Certainly. Yes.
So that
absolutely.
played some sort of a role.
Yes.
Do you also feel that, because this is another question that I think has come up for people, is that you had somewhat of another identity when you were here?
I think, yes. I think that's probably true of anyone. Like, I've lived in New York for a long time, but I'm also Canadian and I grew up in Toronto. And I also spend enough time here. I think whenever you're out of your full-time life, then it releases you from, like, the grooves of my life in New York at this point are so deep. And my grooves of my life in Paris, I have grooves here, but they're not nearly as deep. So you get to be a slightly different person, and one that I sometimes think that when we talk about relationships or long-term relationships, at least in my life, I match myself with cities more than people. Like the person Paris allows me to be is that matches best in this city is different than the person that New York allows me to be. And I enjoy both people, and I wouldn't give either up. But yes, absolutely. It's a different city. It brings out different parts of you. It's a different way of life.
And so the language perhaps as well, because you can sort of navigate without feeling the same burdens perhaps.
You don't, it allows you to tune out a little bit. So I am Canadian, and I can read French better than I can do everything better than speak French. I can understand it better. I can read it better. I can speak it a tiny bit. But I think when you're in a place where you're not fluent in the language, it serves as a white noise, which is really wonderful because it like releases you from your environment a little bit and eavesdropping in a weird way, which is somewhat delightful in New York sometimes. But like you're sort of a little bit in your own world, which is
what you were seeking also.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't seeking silence so much, but yes,
no.
It allows you to
the opposite of silence.
It allows you to move differently, like sort of like a different waterway to move through, for sure. Yeah, less and less the more time I spent. Like it's a different. My relationship with the city changes so dramatically each time I'm here because it becomes more familiar, and the language becomes more familiar. But just like the cultural expectations and mores of Paris, like become not so exotic anymore, which is the same of any relationship, I think, people or city or whatever.
No, but it's interesting because there's this idea that you sort of can have an adventure in another city that you can't allow yourself to have in your home city or your adopted city in your case.
Yeah.
And that there's something we can tap into by simply changing the environment.
I think it's a combination of the way, how would I phrase this? I don't like speaking in broad terms, but I would say, and there are some New Yorkers here, maybe can back me up on this. I think New York is a very power-driven city, and that influences dating to a degree that is hard. Like it's suffocating and aggressive and competitive and all of those things. And I don't think Paris is a power-driven city. And those goals, the joke is American women come here and go out on one date, and especially when you're from New York, and like French men can get serious very quickly, and whereas that's not the same in America. But I don't think that's entirely true. But there's just like a different mentality here around it. So it's a combination of both those things. You're both tapping into a different part of yourself, and you're in a place that views all of these interactions differently.
Well, would the French power then be pleasure in that case?
I think so.
Right. But speaking of that.
Well, so Paris is an international city, and I think increasingly international. I wouldn't have said this necessarily 10 years ago, but my impression, having spent regular time here over the last decade, is that it increasingly has an international feeling to it. Like you're just encountering French people, you're encountering, Europeans, people from Africa, people from all over, in a way that I think was not necessarily the case, at least in my experience. I'm certainly not an expert. Like I'm always careful when I talk. I'm not Parisian.
No, but
I'm giving my like half in, half out impressions of things.
Well, certainly it has embraced its international population in a way that it hadn't before.
Yes, and there's a younger feeling here. Like it has a different energy right now than it did.
Well, it was always a global capital.
Yeah.
It just didn't like to claim itself to be.
Right.
But it is very much so. You talking about pleasure, right? A lot of the coverage around the book has been very much focused, even before its release, around sex. The desire for it and the having it, which you do write about. But that
and do
still conceivably have. But it is not the only source of enjoyment in the book, and the message goes far beyond that, and it goes pretty deep on friendship. And you also challenge the idea that to have a compelling story as an older single woman without children, the journey must lead to love. How do you interpret this coverage around the book, and is it just because, well, sex sells and so it's sensationalism, or
Mhm.
does it really go into something much deeper?
It's a big question. It was interesting. I think when I went back and looked at the flap copy of the book to make sure that because I wrote the flap copy, more or less, to make sure that it was like, here's what you can expect. You can expect friendship, and you can, as I say in all of my interviews, although sometimes interviewers are less interested in hearing it, I'm like, core to my life are my friendships. And I joke, not really joke, but when I did CBS Mornings with Gayle King, it was lovely, and it was a lovely interview. She came in beforehand and was asking me, about the book and questions and the things she wanted to talk about. And she says, is there anything that I'm missing? And I said, well, my friendships are really core to my life. And I want to make sure we touch on that. And she goes, forget about it. We're just talking about the sex. And I was like, fair. But what happened was so much of the early coverage, I really wanted this book, just to backtrack a bit, to capture how women, and I can't speak for all women, but how I experience, many people in my life experience pleasure in their lives, and how it is very detached from the narrative of satisfaction for women, which is almost always, fall in love, marriage, possibly children. And I wanted to say, like, we are accessing pleasure or I am accessing pleasure in such a wide variety of ways that I don't see reflected back to me. And I want to try, and that summer seemed to capture it for me. And I wanted to try and capture it in the book. But in the early coverage, all of the coverage was about the sex in the book, which I work in media, so I understand the headline. Like, I get it. But at the same time, what ended up happening was people who were coming to the book after the fact were expecting it to be a book about sex. And so a lot of the criticism I got from readers about a month in was, there's not enough sex in this book. Why isn't there more sex in the book? And I was like, I felt like there was a sufficient amount of me being naked in this book, but I wasn't actually writing porn. I get that maybe that is a market that people should be tapping into, though, based on the responses to the book. But there was a sort of discrepancy between how it was promoted in major news outlets and what was actually in the book, and also what I would always be saying to people, which is, I'd like to talk about a number of other things as well. And I think, and speaking like this summer, All Fours by Miranda July has really taken off too, and a number of other books. I think that there is an absence in culture of any good storytelling around women and sex after a certain age. And I would argue about women and sex in general, but just the absolute hunger that I felt from women over 40 to see any depiction of enjoyable, appealing, attractive sex was really telling to me that we're not getting it. Like, we're getting it in real life, and we're not getting it in culture. And that is condemnation of the culture less than I feel like what's missing in the book. But I'm sorry if you felt like there should be more sex. Because to me, it's interesting though too, because in some ways, a friend who read it early was like, no, the food is the porn in the book. And some people, I think this book is a love letter to my bike personally. And some people are like, we love the biking scene. And one woman wrote me a letter, it stuck in my head so much. She said, the most erotic part of this book is where you just sit in the park by yourself in the quiet reading a book. And I thought, well, that's very American, but also that's a big tell too. I think she also said that she's married with children, which is also,
right. That was her idea.
Absolutely. And I thought, you're right. Like, if I had small kids at home, I also would be more interested than anything to be in a park by myself reading a book and not having anybody bother me.
Give a little bit more about why that was so crucial to your experience here, because obviously you have friends in New York.
Yes.
You have friends in Canada.
Yes.
But what was it that was so special about that month of August with them, as much as it was about exploring sort of this reconnection with touch?
Yeah, we hug. I mean, I think in general, I'm very, I feel very strongly that we convey on friendships, on long-term friendships, the same seriousness that we convey on romantic relationships, because they are, for me anyway, and for many people I know, just as long. They're just as serious. They are just as supportive. They provide the infrastructure for your life, and that we don't have the ritual or the language to convey the respect that deserves is I think frustrating for a lot of people, but something when I'm writing, I'm always just trying to, flesh out what that looks like in my life as a way to, offer. And I'm far from alone in that. There's many books on this. So my friendships in Paris, and all of my friends are here right now. Anybody who wants to pipe up can. But started out with what I say was the best blind date I've ever been set up on, with a woman who's become a very close friend. And we are all not married and no one has kids. And just felt, I think, making friends. There's gotten this question from No One Tells You This, which was my last book. And this was like, how do you make friends when you're older? Which I think is a struggle for some people. And I think particularly people who've been in long-term marriages or coming out of kids who are going to school. But I think making friends when you're older is like, there's something so magical about it because you're so fully yourselves. I'm just looking at all my friends. But you're so like, you have a full sense of yourself and you can bring that to the table. And like, I have friends that I've known for decades who I grew up with, and you keep on with each other, but you're really choosing each other at this age. Like you really recognize in one another, like a similarity and a strength. And I think friendship is something that requires work. Sometimes when I hear married people say like, oh, it requires work, I'm like, this really sounds unpleasant. but like requires like you hold on to each other and you make space for each other. And that was the case, that I missed my friends. And I think I say in the book too, that I have many very close friends who are married. And I joke that like the joy of other people's husbands, like I'm close with my friends' husbands, but there's something wonderful in not having to translate your life to anybody and not having to justify it or say, but this, and just like, it's its own language when we talk about, having something, being fluent in something. So there's such a strength in that.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for it.
But also that means when you pick this up, there's going to be a lot of friendship involved.
There's a lot of friendship in here.
But there's also something else which I really enjoyed, which I didn't expect going into it, was sort of how at some point with some of these friends, you trace historical women that have spent time in different neighborhoods, different places that they became attached to in some way. We know that women have always come to Paris, as have men, but women, we don't care about them right now. Sorry, sir.
It's a friendly space. Thank you for coming.
We like you too. But women have come of all ages, seeking pleasure here. But why do you think Paris is especially appealing to older women? Older with air
older,
quotes.
yeah. Well, my friend Ellie, who's here, put together one Saturday afternoon, like a little tour around Paris of women writers that I sort of followed her around on. And what struck me, there's a couple answers to this question, which is in terms of that tour, what struck me was so many of these women, Simone de Beauvoir, Edith Wharton. I talk about a little bit about Lee Miller in the book, who there's just a movie that came out about her, which is interesting. Were in their mid to late 40s, and that aspect of their life was something that they were all having these, affairs with younger men, and they'd all sought Paris as a refuge from certain parts of their life. Although obviously lived here, and so that element of it was interesting. And Colette, clearly Colette, being the pinnacle of this. But what I find frustrating is when we talk about women in isolation and not in community. So when we talk about Edith Wharton, we don't ever talk about her in community with sort of, I don't know if she ever met Gertrude Stein, although I would have liked to have been there for that, or like Colette, or that they all are existing, or Josephine Baker, like they're all existing in a similar place at a similar time, but we only know them as iconoclasts and not in community with one another. And I always want to know, and part of that tour and that chapter was being like, they live geographically close to each other. What would it have looked like if we understood them the way we understood Hemingway and Fitzgerald, or the way that we understood the way that men, particularly in that 1920s literary scene, the way that men all supported one another was sort of like the Gertrude Stein as, Smurfette in that situation. But and so that was part of it, was just being like, well, how do we think of women as a community? And then part of it, I think, too, is, and then this is a broad strokes answer, which I don't love, but I think culturally in America, women tend to fall off the cultural map right around 40. You know, in television, in movies, you sort of cease to hear from them. And I think, and I'm not a Parisian, but I think Paris, France possibly, allows women to age in the culture differently and remain visible. And that the combination of that with an element of pleasure, that's someone said to me, and I've repeated this in many interviews, which is in America, you have to earn your pleasure, like literally monetarily work to have a holiday. And here it is considered a right.
Right.
And I think that is the difference. And so at an age when you're becoming invisible in America and in a culture where you're constantly having to justify any pleasure compared to a country where women as they age remain visible, can argue about how they remain visible, but they definitely remain visible in a country that prioritizes pleasure in a different way. I think the combination of those two things allows women to enjoy what I consider the most powerful years of your life in a place that supports that.
Well, this was also the home for sexual liberation, you know, a long time ago. And I think, you know, at least that generation has never left sort of collective consciousness.
Yes. I also think healthcare is part. I think there's no way to remove healthcare from any of these. For someone who lives in America, like I can't remove the healthcare part of this from any conversation, which is the finances of it being so punishing too. And I know it's more complicated than that here, but so I think it's a combination of those two things. Is like you're reaching a point in the States where you're sort of falling off the map and you're feeling very powerful and pleasure is accessible, and you don't fall off the map here in the same way culturally. So it's pretty appealing.
Well, maybe there's a chance for certain women to make a comeback in America since we are now uniting against J.D. Vance. I only bring him up because your book seems to have come out at sort of a really opportune moment.
Yeah.
Just before.
Not that I would ever say thank you, J.D. Vance.
No. We won't go that far. But you know, you came out with this, and you're able to then comment in, you know, essays that were published widely on his childless cat lady criticisms. And I feel like that's a very interesting tie-in to what you're sort of arguing here. What do you think is behind words like his? And, you know, they're not just his. There are plenty of other men in the world, including in France, to be fair.
Yes, absolutely.
Who believe that, you know, the way that you're proposing to live your life, or that you are living your life, is somehow unhealthy, abnormal,
scary.
Scary is the word you're going to use. Okay.
No, I think it's scary.
No, but go on.
No, and just whenever I do these interviews, not just on that particular topic, but I think I'm careful when I do interviews in the States to be like, France is not an idyllic oasis of perfection. There's not that anyone needs to know, but like there's a lot. I'm always like careful to do that because I think right now in America there is this like, get me out of here. What do you mean that you can go to the doctor? You know, sense of wow, geez. When I wrote an op-ed in May before the book came out, they put a crazy headline on, but I think it sold books, so God bless them. It was something like, men fear me, society shames me, but I love my life. And the premise of it was, sat on the homepage for a solid 48 hours, and I was like, RIP my inbox, but actually I didn't get that much hate mail, so it was nice. The premise of it was, I just turned 50 2 weeks ago, and I was born the year after Roe was passed. The same year women in America were allowed to have credit cards and bank accounts in their own name for the first time. And possibly, I don't know what the laws were in France, but I know it's
pretty delayed as well.
Yeah, the same in Canada was exactly the same year. And that the life I'm leading with financial and physical agency is, you know, a result of both of those things. And that we're seeing so many women make these similar choices is not disconnected from the violent rollback of women's rights in America. That it's this, oh, no, the women are doing okay without us. How do we get them back under our control? And
insulting us is a good way to start.
But I mean, like even the overturning of, you know, Roe and their, you know, the attempt to overturn no fault divorce and a lot of other laws that are in the works, you can feel this absolute, you know, hatred. And the rise of trad wives, et cetera, et cetera. And so I wrote that. And between that and my last book, No One Tells You This, people would say to me, don't you think that we're past this, that you're sort of imagining that there's a social stigma, that people have a problem with you not being married and not having kids? And I'm like, I don't think that, but maybe. And then JD Vance comes out 6 weeks later with Childless Cat Lady. And I was like, it's not my imagination. This is literally what is happening. And what's been astounding to me, not astounding, but what's been pleasantly surprising to me is the degree of pushback against him. Because I think in 2016, I covered, I was a politics reporter for a while, and I covered the 2008 election with Hillary and obviously 2016. It was like, there was plenty of insults along these lines being hurled at Hillary, right? Like the ball crusher, the this, and that, like awful things said to her that sort of made waves, but didn't. So when he said that, my first inclination was like, oh, this is just another sort of dumb, insulting thing that is coming from the usual sources. And the absolute pushback against it from all corners and, Taylor Swift's endorsement, all of it has been incredible to me in terms of reflecting the amount of women living lives like this who are like not just offended, like deeply offended, not offended that like a person like JD Vance thinks that, but offended at the idea that this could be a political platform.
Right.
That there's offended at the idea that there's something to feel shame about, I guess, is more what it's about. Like, why wouldn't I want the cat? What is it about the behavior of men in America right now that suggests that I wouldn't prefer the cat? But like
that's exactly it.
The bear meme that was going around a while, earlier this summer of like, would you rather meet a man or a bear in the woods or whatever it is? So that's been incredible to me, actually. And that it aligns with like themes in the book just has on occasion made me want to write my publisher and say, I told you so.
Well,
but I didn't.
There was a question, actually. I put out a sort of call on Instagram if people had any questions they wanted to ask you. And actually, I think most of those people are here, including someone who asked, to your point, about writing to your publisher. I do love I have the most amazing editor, so I shouldn't. So maybe that plays into why they were so keen to have your proposal from the beginning. But how was it received by your agent and your publishers? So were they open to tapping into this theme, or were they nervous that this was maybe sensitive terrain?
So my last book, No One Tells You This, which is about turning 40 and not being married and not having kids, and it both being great and also being the prime caretaker for my mother who was dying at the time and a bunch of other family stuff. When I went to sell that, it was against a wall of total disbelief that anyone would consider this an appealing story. So when that book did reasonably well, I was a little bit like, and subsequently people read that and go, I don't understand, what's the big deal? And I'm like, that's how quickly things change. When I went to sell this book, so I'd already published a book, my agent got it pretty immediately.
As in understood what you were trying to do?
Yes.
Okay.
When we went out with it, I won't get into like the how sausage gets made of publishing, but we went out to like, I think like 25 editors with this proposal. And I want to say like 18 of them turned it down, which is not abnormal, right? That's not an abnormal experience, but it was the manner in which they turned it down. Like a normal rejection from an editor would be like, Dear Lucy, who's my agent's name. Dear Lucy, thanks so much for thinking of us for this. It's not for us right now. Hope you're well and would love to have coffee soon and hear what else you're working on. Like a very polite 3-line, totally fine. That's what you'd expect. Of the 17 rejections we got, something like 14 of them were like paragraphs long rejections where they were like, Dear Lucy. I kept them all because I worked some of them into the flap copy. Like I was like, if you're going to write this all out, I'm absolutely using it for my own benefit. But they were very kind, but it was a lot of like, I read this proposal and I changed my plans for this weekend and I tried to do what Glynnis did and like prioritize pleasure. But actually, we're just not sure how to sell this book. So we can't. So like, it was a lot of like, and it was making Lucy insane because she said, there's nothing, a lot of times when people take that much time to say no, they'll tell you what they think's wrong with it. She was like, there's no feedback here that we can work with to like reconfigure this proposal. And I said, I'm not surprised. But So there was a lot of that, but that told me that we're hitting a nerve and that publishing sometimes is not
ready.
Adventurous.
Overly conservative.
But the editor we got, it went to auction with like 3 editors and they all got it, which was a good place to be. But it was a lot of like people not quite knowing what to do with it, even though they liked it. And I think part of that wasn't just pleasure. Part of it is it doesn't have like a traditional narrative arc, which I address very directly in the book. Just because some reviewer was like, there's no instigating action. And I was like, I literally say that in the opening of the
Although,
book.
is that entirely true? I mean, you had a year in your house without being touched. I feel like that's quite a...
That's instigating. Yeah, it's very instigating. So there was a lot of that. It was a lot of like, it was clear it was hitting a nerve, but no one quite knew what to do with it. And then we landed with the right person. As any agent will tell you, you only need one editor to say yes. But when you're in the process of being said no to 25 times in a row, you're like...
Pretty demoralizing.
Where's that editor?
Someone just say yes.
Yeah, exactly. But I got the best editor. I mean, I really was happy with everything. So I was very fortunate.
But also that means the universe was sort of...
Yes.
Heading in the direction for this to have a spotlight.
It was in the air. I don't know. Like,
it doesn't always happen.
No. But like now when people are talking about how Kamala Harris is, running the Joy campaign, I'm like, send her this book.
Joy is next to pleasure,
exactly.
Right?
Enjoy yourself, Kamala. Yeah. Enjoy yourself. But it's definitely, I think a lot of women in particular came out of COVID, and women with children. I mean, many of my friends with children, I say that at the beginning of the book, or just like, hate everybody. And then they'd feel guilty. And I'm like, you're the 10th person to tell me that this week. So you're not alone. But I think there was a lot of like, why are we working so hard?
But I think it's a very interesting moment you've captured also, the starting point. You also speak about freelance writing. And as a fellow freelance writer, it's lots of feelings involved in that. And I wanted to then, this connects to the last question, which comes from Kim. Is Kim here? Is there a Kim?
Yeah.
Maybe she... Hey, Kim! You asked me this question, right? Okay, all right. So she's sort of curious, besides the success of your books, what do you think is the most satisfying part of the writing process, whether it's for books or your essays, and what is your least favorite part? Because this is more of a process question that I think is very interesting because you do all sorts of writing.
I think this answer would have been different 5 or 10 years ago, and I'll tell you what. But for me, the most satisfying part is not the first draft, which feels terrible from beginning to end, in my experience. It's just like an act of faith where you're like, oh, I'm the worst writer in the entire world. Everyone's going to find out. It's the revision part where everything falls together and you get that sense of, I mean, I'm not a musician, but that sense of like hitting the tuning fork and the piano note matches it exactly. Like I've matched exactly what I was thinking and wanted to say with the words on the page. Like I am clearly articulating my idea and maybe have even come up with like a better version of it by writing it down. So that for me is the most satisfying part. Like the most satisfying part of this was when I sort of handed in that somewhat final draft. Like there's so many errors in the galley that you have, like, but it was mostly where I wanted it to be. And I felt really happy about that. I think 5 years ago, I would have said having it go out in the world and having other people resonate, which is incredibly pleasurable. I'm so grateful when people tell me that, they recognize themselves in it, or this was so important to them. But publishing a book these days in the environment we're in, with the absence of budgets and publishing houses, where so much of the work falls on the writer to like call in favors and do your own publicity, has become exhausting to a degree that it's removed somewhat of the pleasure of putting a book out in the world.
The hustle train.
The hustling of your own book. And when you're hustling a memoir, it's sort of like, I'm sure hustling for everyone is terrible, but it's a lot of asking people to do things for you, which can become just exhausting. And that sort of removes, at least in that initial sort of month, the first month of the book, is that removes sort of the pleasure of having it resonate so much, because you're just in this narrow, 6 months later, I think it becomes enjoyable again. But for me, it's the first draft is awful. If anyone's in a first draft being like, this is terrible, I'm like, it's terrible for everyone. No one likes the first draft.
And that's true for
Yeah.
articles. It's not just true for books. It's, you put words on the page and you're
like... When I write articles, I make myself put a first draft down, even if it doesn't make sense, just so I have something there that I can come back to and work with. First drafts are torturous.
Well, it just makes you doubt yourself.
Yeah.
Every single time.
Why don't I work for a corporation? Right. It's not something I think often, but definitely one paragraph into the first draft of something, I'm like, this was a bad life decision.
But clearly not.
No,
but
at the end of the day, it's not.
You have enjoyed yourself.
Yes.
And you're still enjoying yourselves.
Yeah.
And you're all here. Can we before we go to questions, let's give an
applause
for Glynnis.
That's the show for today. Thanks for listening, as always. If you're streaming this on Spotify, be sure to check out a little poll that awaits you pertaining to this discussion. Just scroll down on the episode page within the app and vote. And if you enjoy the show, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, share with a friend, and pick up the books that inspired it, The New Paris and The New Parisienne. Until next time, à bientôt.